On behalf of the Department of Economics, Department of Political Science, and the Center for Latin American Studies, thank you to everyone for joining us for this talk. Dr. Heribert Dieter, a warm welcome to you, sir, from the Department of Economics, and to our collaborating institution, International Center Goa, and its director, Mrs. Nandini Sahai. May I welcome you both, sir and madam, onto the stage, and also may I request Mrs. Sahai to introduce our guest speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this lecture cum interactive session on Europe after the crisis, a big leap forward or small-scale reforms by Dr. Heribert Dieter. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Dieter once again. He was here in December 2007 to deliver a lecture at GIM, which was organized by ICG. We are happy that he accepted our invite to deliver a lecture on a very pressing problem, the European crisis. We are very grateful to the Department of Economics, Political Science, and Center for Latin American and International Studies of the Goa University for collaborating with us for today's lecture. Thank you. I was hoping Dr. Shetty would be here, but thank you, Pranav. And we are also very thankful for all of you for sparing your valuable time to be here with us today. Allow me to introduce our speaker to you. Dr. Dieter is a senior fellow at Research Unit Global Issues, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Berlin. He was also the former professor, chair of international relations, Ruhr University, Bochum, and a former visiting professor, Asia Research Center, Murdoch University, Perth, Australia. He has also published articles on global economy and European crisis. As you may be aware, the European sovereign debt crisis, often referred to as the Eurozone crisis, is an ongoing financial crisis that has made it difficult or impossible for some countries in the Euro area to repay or refinance their government debt without the assistance of third parties. The crisis did not only introduce adverse economic effects for the worst hit countries, but also had a major political impact on the ruling governments in 8 out of 17 Eurozone countries, leading to power shifts in Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Slovenia, Slovakia, and the Netherlands. There was also a suicide surge. Well, indeed, this is a major all this is of major concern, and I'm sure Dr. Dieter will throw more light on this. I now welcome him to deliver this lecture, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sahai, for your kind words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. It is a pleasure to be back in Goa. I need not to point out from what weather conditions I have escaped in Berlin. It was one of the longest and greyest and coldest winters on record. And of course, the European crisis is also a temptation to leave that old continent for a little while and to come to a different part of the world. I will look at the situation in Europe. I value the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on the future of Europe. It is, of course, fair to say that until recently, and until recently is, of course, before the events in Cyprus, the situation looked a bit calmer. The situation looked better. Even the elections in Italy in February did not cause major turbulence in financial markets, and that was new. For the last 3 years, any political event in Europe triggered turbulence in financial markets. Italy, the non-ability of Italian political parties to form a government did not result in any kind of fluctuation in share markets, spike in interest rates, or the likes. And Cyprus, of course, was difficult and will continue to be difficult. But Cyprus, again, has, on balance, not been as much of that much of a shock as some observers have feared. It's okay. Of course, it is still too early to tell. It is still too early to say whether the euro will survive. Whether the euro will survive, at least in its current form. Over time, societies in the Eurozone will ask themselves whether the cost of staying in the euro is higher than the benefits from membership. The This is a rather simple question, and some countries are already asking that quite intensely. Not Germany, although in Germany we have a debate, but you look to countries like Finland, where there has been an intensive debate already, whether they wouldn't be better off without the euro and with the reintroduction of their own currency, the Finmark. Of course, and I will come back to the political dimension frequently in my presentation. Of course, the one-dimensional rhetoric that European policymakers implemented has not helped. The one-dimensional rhetoric has made societies, has led to a more critical evaluation of the European integration process by societies. A good example is perhaps German Chancellor Angela Merkel's frequent use of the term these rescue operations are without alternative. Almost sounds like Margaret Thatcher, I'm afraid. She used the German term alternativlos. There is no alternative to what we're doing. And that is, of course, that doesn't go down well in democratic societies. There are always alternatives, as we know. Any economist can come up with 15 alternatives at least that could have been implemented. And this attempt to kind of oppress any opposition to the rescue operations by saying they are without alternative hasn't been digested well. Citizens feel sidelined in the European Union, in the integration process, and as I stand here in 2013, the European integration process perhaps is not without alternative. 5 years ago, if I would have said that, that would have been a rather lunatic assessment. In 2013, citizens are questioning whether there are alternatives to the current integration paths. So the first political result of the rescue operation is rather negative. Europeans have started, and I repeat, not just in Germany and Finland, to consider the utility of the integration process. In Germany, calling the further implementation of the Eurozone is no longer an exercise for a small majority. In 2012, the conservative historian Arnulf Barim, I'm pretty sure you haven't heard that name before, but he's a rather influential figure in Germany, he called the euro, from a German perspective, a Versailles without a wall. Now that is a rather brutal statement. He said this is resulting in a payment obligation for Germany without a preceding war. And that is a small minority position, but it is a position that continues to be heard. Angela Merkel has, in her crisis management, failed to address those concerns. She has failed to take those people that are critical of rescue operations, that don't want to bail out Greece, that don't want to bail out Spain and Italy. She has failed to take those concerns on board. She has failed to communicate properly why this is all done. And in a talk show in October 2011, she said, made some rather interesting statements. Angela Merkel normally doesn't do talk shows, one should say. She normally doesn't engage in talk shows because she's not very good at it. In that 2011 talk show, she said, if Germany would no longer have the euro but would go back to the Deutschmark, we would suffer the same fate as Switzerland. Germany would suffer the same fate as Switzerland. And of course you can imagine the next day the newspapers were full of comments that said, well, that's not such a bad fate to suffer from. It's not that bad to be a Switzerland. It's not leading to poverty, it's leading to very high standards of living. And this attempt of Angela Merkel to say, well, we crucially depend on the euro, we Germans are the main beneficiaries of the euro, that did not convince her audience. It backfired. Another mantra that we have often heard in the debate is that Germans are the main beneficiaries of monetary integration. Every other newspaper writes the Germans are, or the German economy for that matter, is the main beneficiary of European monetary integration. Stable, the euro has resulted in an improvement of the economic environment for German companies in particular. So if that is the case, my simple question is, well, if the Germans are the main beneficiaries, they should be more affluent than the rest of the lot. So, if Germans are the main beneficiaries, then the wealth levels should be higher than in other countries that are not the main beneficiaries of the euro. So the Germans should be more affluent, for instance, than the Italians. This would be the expectation if they are the main beneficiaries. Well, the interesting answer to that question is that the Germans are not the most affluent citizens in Europe, in the Eurozone, let alone in Europe. In 2012, Credit Suisse, one of the two large Swiss banks, published a global wealth data book. It was published in 2012. And what they list is the average level of wealth per adult in US dollars. So that is shares, savings, property, minus debt per adult in US dollars. The list is topped in Europe. The list is topped, of course, by Switzerland, this suffering Switzerland, where the average citizen, the average adult citizen, has a net wealth of 468,000 US dollars, the average. That is not the median, the average. In the Eurozone, we do have significantly poorer countries. We have countries like Slovakia, where the average adult has a net wealth position of 25,000, or Greece, where the average position is net wealth position is 90,000. Spain, where it's 104,000. Finland, 145. Netherlands, 173,000. Then comes Italy with 213,000, and then comes France with $265,000 net wealth position per annum. So where are the Germans? Where are the Germans? You of course expect the Germans to be wealthier than the French, given the current hype about the German economy, given that everybody at the moment seems to think that the Germans can walk over water, at least in the economic domain. Well, the German net wealth position per adult is 174,000 US dollars. That is not poor. It is 37% of the Swiss level, it is 65% of the French level, and 82% of the Italian level. So Germans are not poor, but they're certainly not as affluent as the Italians. They're certainly not as affluent as the French. When you look at the AAA rated, now we come a bit closer to finance, when you look at the AAA rated countries in the Eurozone, which are Germany, Netherlands and Finland, those have lower levels of individual wealth than the not so well rated countries, Italy and France. Put simply, those countries where the government budget is okay, citizens consequently are poorer, those governments where citizens have successfully tax optimized, the government budget is not as solid as it is in those other countries. Where this becomes a problem is when Italy and Spain are demanding bailouts. Italy in particular. This is whenever we talk about the European crisis, the 500-pound gorilla on the theatre, on the stage is Italy. It becomes very difficult for policymakers in the north to create political support for a bailout operation for Italy, because people are aware of these differences in wealth levels, and they do not understand, they do not support the idea that Northern European taxpayers shall be bailing out an affluent country like Italy, which has had a very active prime minister, probably not in Rome, but a country where tax collection could be improved, but tax collection isn't improved, and that is a problem for Brussels and for those that would like to do something for the South. You could argue that in Europe and in those countries that are currently affected by crisis, and you are all aware that this is primarily affecting countries in the south of the European Union, at least some countries, Italy in particular, could help themselves. Now you could ask yourself, well, why is the man giving such a lengthy introduction? I'm still in the introduction. I think it is very important to understand the political dimension of this process. It is not just a question of numbers, it is a question of political legitimacy, it's a question of political support, and without political support, both the European Union and the single currency will not have a bright future ahead of themselves. At the same time, I would argue, and that's why I've suggested to talk about Europe after the crisis. I think at the same time, the situation in Europe is better than some observers make us believe. It is better than the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal make us believe. If you look at the fiscal deficit of the entire Eurozone in 2012, that figure is -3% of GDP. That is not perfect, but that is much better than you would assume when you hear all that crisis talk about Europe. -3% of GDP is, by the way, exactly what the Treaty of Maastricht suggested as an entry barrier. Countries can only enter the monetary union if their deficit is below -3% or lower. So, ironically speaking, the Eurozone could enter the Eurozone following the criteria of the Treaty of Maastricht. The situation in Europe is much better than the situation in the United States, Japan, or the United Kingdom. Last year, the US had a fiscal deficit of -7%, the UK of -8.4%, Japan of -9.5%, of course, as always, a record, and even Canada with -3.5% has an inferior fiscal policy compared to the Eurozone. Now, if you suggest this is the average, that is misleading. Yes, it's true, it's the average, it's misleading. Some countries are having a more sustainable fiscal policy. Germany is one of them. The fiscal deficit of Germany last year was 0.25%, so that was pretty good. But even the countries that are in trouble are not looking that bad. Italy had a deficit in 2012 of 2.8%, Spain of 6.7%, which is of course not sustainable, France of 4.5%. Greece is the worst performer at 7.6%, which is still better than the UK in the same year. So the situation on the in fiscal policy is not perfect, but it is not nearly as bad as some people have been suggesting. And where there is a dramatic change is in the current account, balances of the European economy. Spain was, of course, one of the more problematic, if not the most problematic cases. Spain had a current account deficit of -10% in 2008, and this year they will have a modest surplus. In other words, Spain no longer borrows money from the rest of the world, it is paying back money, and that is an enormous improvement. The euro area in total has a current account surplus of 0.7% in 2012, so it's neither lending too much to the rest of the world nor borrowing too much to the rest of the world if you look at the capital account, or if you look at the current account, the exports are not that much bigger than the imports. Even Greece, and Greece is, apart from Cyprus, the most complicated case in the crisis. Even Greece is looking better. Next year, in the next years, I should say, Greek interest payments on government debt will be as low as 5.5% of GDP. And when we look at Greece or Italy, it is very tempting to compare their current situation with the situation that they were confronted with before joining the euro. So how much did they pay for interest on government debt before they joined the euro? And the situation was much worse in Greece in, say, 1994, so before the European monetary integration began. They had to pay more than 11% of GDP on interest payments for government debt alone. So the situation is not as bad as you think it is. As I said, not perfect. At the moment, and in recent months and years, the debate has been concentrating on the risks, which are of course substantial, and have not looked at the positive developments. Now, in the remaining time, this was the introduction, it's the end of the introduction here. In the remaining time, I will look at 3 points. And I will look at, first, the monetary policy of the European Central Bank. Will the euro be saved, but the cost of the operation being high inflation? This is, of course, a very German question. I'll come back to that. In other words, have the mistakes of the Great Depression and of monetary policy in the Great Depression been learned, but have the old mistakes been replaced by new ones? Second point I would like to look at is, can the Europeans in their crisis management learn from the United States of America? Have the Americans, do the Americans understand better how capitalism works? And should we learn from the Americans? I'm always a bit reluctant to suggest that, but there may be a thing or two that the Americans know about finance. And third point, what is the future of the Eurozone? Will the Eurozone, and that is basically the answer to the question I have been suggesting, will the Eurozone make a big leap forward, or will our future be rather a combination of small-scale reforms that leave the existing structures basically intact? I will, in that context, ask whether there are alternatives to the current mainstream centralization fetish that you can observe. First point, monetary policy. Basically a comparison of today and then. How was monetary policy in the Great Depression and how is it today? One lesson has been learned, and that is a quite clear lesson. In particular, the Americans learned that before the crisis, the situation in the 1920s and in the first decade of the 21st century looked not that there were similarities. Before the crash, there was a widespread perception that a new era had begun, that new methods had been developed. There was widespread euphoria, and the understanding or the perception of risks was very limited. In the 1920s, methods of production had been created, Fordism and Taylorism, just to name them in passing. Basically, new ways of organizing economies had been invented. 80 years later, it was financial innovation that captured the imagination of observers and market participants alike. Financial innovations were meant to enable people without an income or very small income to buy large properties in California. And that was not only the case in the United States of America, this was also the case in Spain, this was also the case in Ireland. There was euphoria, there was a property bubble. I am quite critical of those so-called financial innovations. I think they are elaborated instruments that conceal risk. They haven't helped us all that much. They have hidden risk and they haven't contributed to financial stability. Paul Volcker, the towering giant of American finance, former chairman of the Federal Reserve and now advisor to President Obama. He has been suggesting that, and I quote, "The only useful innovation in the financial sector in the last 25 years has been the automatic teller machine." So Volcker is critical of all those asset-backed securities, of creating CDOs and CDO squared and whatever have you. Looking back to the 1930s and the response of the Federal Reserve, then the Federal Reserve implemented a very restrictive monetary policy at the time, and that is the big difference. The money supply measured in M2 shrank by about a third between 1929 and 1933. Today, money supply rose, that's in the United States, rose by 15% from 2007 to 2009. In the Great Depression, the Fed didn't react all that much. They just sat there and waited. They considered the crisis as an appropriate correction of exuberance, to use Alan Greenspan's words. And neither bank runs nor the credit crunch encouraged the Fed to inject liquidity into the shrinking economy. In essence, there was no lender of last resort in the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve in the United States did not lend freely at penalty rates against good collateral. They just waited and watched the economy shrink. In Germany at the time, the president of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Schacht, tried to inject liquidity into the system, but the collapse of the largest German bank at the time, the Darmstädter Nationalbank, in July 1931, led the central bank to reduce money supply due to dwindling reserves. We still talk about gold standard mechanisms with fatal consequences for the domestic economy. We know about the mistakes of the Fed at the time. This is well researched. Basically, the seminal piece on that is Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman's 1963, A Monetary History of the United States, in which they suggested that the Great Contraction was not due to shrinking demand, the Keynesian position, but rather they said the subsequently, not the crash of 29, but the subsequent reduction of liquidity made the depression a Great Depression. Schwartz and Friedman had suggested that if the Fed would have provided sufficient liquidity in the years after 29, there would not have been a Great Depression which had so fatal consequences. They do not argue that there would not have been a depression. They do argue that there would have been a crisis, but the crisis would have been shallower, and that's, I think, would have been a major achievement. Today, the Fed, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England flood markets with liquidity. They flood markets with liquidity, and this is an experiment. We don't know what the consequences of this experiment will be. Put in a simple kind of picture, will the abundance of firefighting water result in significant inflation? Will too much liquidity result in inflation or not? Some people argue the central banks will be able to mop up that excess liquidity once the situation becomes more benign and economic growth returns. This is a question. Or will this current policy lead to moral hazard? Will the financial sector expect that it will continuously be protected from its own mistakes from the central banks? This is a question that nobody can answer at this juncture. We can discuss it, but we don't know. We don't know exactly. We don't know what the exact developments in the near future will be. It's unfair to predict and incorrect and inappropriate to predict that there will definitely be high inflation. This is, nobody knows that exactly. and for the time being, inflation is at an unproblematic level. But what we may see, and this is just a question, the great contraction of Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman is replaced by the great gamble that the big central banks have now embarked on. Harvard economist Martin Feldstein in the Financial Times wrote in the Financial Times in November 2012, the ECB, the European Central Bank, has joined the Fed and the Bank of England in a risky experiment. This is a very diplomatic and very cautious assessment. You may, of course, think, well, this is a very German position. Germans are obsessed with inflation. And I agree, we are obsessed with inflation. We have had two hyperinflations in the last century. The hyperinflation of 1923 wiped out fortunes of millions and millions of people. For us in Germany, inflation is more than a risk to wealth. It is a risk to political stability. For us, these unfortunate developments in the 1920s have been key to the rise of fascism in Germany, and we are just a bit more sensitive, I think, than many other people are. I think it is fair to say that the pride that Germans had in their own currency before the Deutschmark, before the euro was introduced, goes back to those fears of the past. In the mid-1980s, the then president of the European Commission, a Frenchman, he suggested that not all Germans believe in God, but all Germans believe in the Bundesbank. And of course, you do understand why this obsession, where this obsession has come from. In this environment of inflation fears in Europe, comes a demand from the Union of Employees of the European Central Bank to get inflation index salaries. It is their job to keep inflation at bay, and the employees at the ECB ask for inflation index salaries. You can understand that this is, of course, not fueling the confidence in the ECB's job when the own employees are asking for inflation index contracts. Perhaps the European Central Bank should have a course or two on the public relations of crisis. That would help quite a bit. So in monetary policy, we don't know. It may be difficult. It may be able that Mario Draghi and others are able to control money supply and to mop it up, but it is not sure. Second point, what can the Europeans learn from the United States of America and its crisis management? I'm not reluctant to put the German crisis, the European crisis management, the Eurozone crisis management into the same category as Japan's crisis management, and not American crisis management. In essence, the European crisis management has been timid and has tried to protect banks, has been trying to protect too many banks. The result is that in the crisis we don't get rid of players that are not able to survive in the marketplace. And in essence, too many banks have been rescued. Too many Irish banks have been rescued, too many Spanish banks have been rescued, and this is dangerous. Hitherto unknown banks, banks that even observers of financial markets didn't know, are suddenly declared systemically relevant. There's an inflationary use of the term systemically relevant, and this is not appropriate in a capitalist system. You can talk about other systems, but we do have a capitalist system. In a capitalist system, it is not correct to protect banks that have done a bad job. they should leave the marketplace. Now the question is, what are the Americans doing? Are the Americans closing banks? And the Americans do that. The Americans, the Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation, people in dark suits, men usually in dark suits, arriving on a Friday afternoon, taking over the management of a bank, and then reopening on Monday. They have been closing over 450 banks since 2008. Amongst them was the sixth largest Washington Mutual, and I think the Americans have, by doing that, sent the right signals to the financial sector. Those that are not good at doing their job will be closed. Depositors will be protected, mind you, but bondholders and shareholders will not be protected. And this is the right recipe. Depositors should be protected, bondholders not, shareholders not, or not fully. In Germany, we had an intensive debate whether Lehman, the collapse of Lehman on the 15th of September 2008 was a mistake or not. The leading German weekly journal, Der Spiegel, said this was the mistake of the century. Well, the century is pretty short in 2008, so we're not sure what other mistakes will be coming later on. But they said not rescuing Lehman was the mistake of the century. In Europe, we see, I already mentioned that, more and more greater use of the term systemically relevant. The Deputy President of the European Central Bank, Vitor Constantino, I think he's Portuguese, said in April 2012, there are 36 systemically relevant banks in the Eurozone, which means more than 2 per country. And you know that some of the countries in the Eurozone are smaller than a suburb of any medium-sized Indian city. So that would mean 2 per country, including countries like Malta, Luxembourg, Cyprus, and so on and so forth. This is a timid position. This is a reflection of intellectual capture. The financial sector has portrayed successfully that many of its participants, many of its banks, have to be rescued, otherwise financial markets will collapse. I would argue that the European Central Bank demonstrates a lack of intellectual independence from the financial sector, and that is very risky. I would suggest, or I do suggest, that the number of systemically relevant banks in the European Monetary Union is perhaps less than 10. And if there are systemically relevant banks, they should be split up. There is no place for systemically relevant banks in a market system or in a capitalist economy. They should be split up, and they should be small enough to be able to go. So the question is, what are the Americans thinking about systemically relevant? About systemic relevance. How many banks does the Federal Reserve, the central bank, consider to be systemically relevant? And policymakers in the United States have given an answer to that question. They have said 0. 0 banks are considered to be systemically relevant in the United States. The Dodd-Frank Act, the law that tries to make the financial sector more stable, prohibits the direct recapitalization of banks by the Fed. And that is a textbook answer. There is no necessity for the Fed to do that. Banks should perhaps not be under the illusion that the central bank comes to their rescue. I think Europeans ought to keep in mind that keeping the capitalist system both dynamic and restrict the damaging influence of poor performers requires bankruptcy and requires the exclusion from the marketplace. The problem in Europe is that the political costs of rescue operations can be put to the supranational level. Take, for instance, the largest Spanish bank, Bankia. The bank is failing, and it still has a share price. And other Europeans shall support that bank. Now the question is, why should other Europeans support the shareholders of a failing bank in Spain? Why not close that bank or nationalize it, wipe out the shareholders, and force them to accept losses? I think this is the recipe that we should have tried out earlier. Shareholder capital should be wiped out completely, then a haircut of bondholders of the affected bank, and then European support as the last resort. How does Cyprus fit into that picture? Well, Cyprus, one should say, it has, before the crisis, been a successful tax haven. It attracted capital from other European economies and from Russia. In that sense, Cyprus was more similar, more akin to Iceland than to any other Eurozone economy. The business model of the banks was that they refinanced their businesses not with shares or bonds, resulting in a very small capital base. When faced with a collapsing banking sector in Cyprus, Europeans faced a dilemma. They could have rescued banks which were kind of having assets of very dodgy origin, but this would have weakened the integration process further. It would have been very difficult to sell this to Northern European taxpayers, that Russian oligarchs have to be rescued, or their money rather. And that was not a good idea. So what was done, and you know what was done, depositors above 100,000 euro, which is not an insignificant amount, 100,000 are safe. Money above that amount is not safe. And the question is whether it was a good idea to have a participation of depositors. I think it was a good idea. The other alternatives would have been worse. And this is what we always have in this European crisis. You have the choice between bad and worse alternatives. There are no nice alternatives. It is a choice between a rock and a hard place. The alternatives would have been a rescue operation financed by other European taxpayers, a collapse of the bank Iceland style without any kind of support from the rest of Europe, or the current solution. And against those two alternatives, I think what was chosen is the least disruptive and not a nice, but the least disruptive model. For the first time, depositors were hit, and I think that is appropriate and necessary. The side effect, and again I'm coming back to the 500-pound gorilla on the stage, the side effect is that Italy, and Italian society and Spanish society have learned that the buck stops somewhere, and that not all rescue operations that are possible will be implemented. Final point. Are there alternatives to the centralization of fiscal policy, to a banking union? In other words, does Europe need more Europe to solve its current problems? The mainstream in Europe says yes. The mainstream in Europe says, in order to survive, the euro needs centralization. We need centralized control of fiscal policy. We need financial supervision. We need centralized deposit insurance schemes. Currently, we don't have centralized deposit insurance schemes. This is what some people, also in the Anglo-Saxon press, misunderstood. The current system is that there's a uniform level of 100,000 euro that are guaranteed by the individual governments, not by Brussels and not by the other European countries. The answer on Main Street to that question is no. Main Street doesn't want more centralization. Main Street doesn't want more centralization, and Main Street asks why more Europe is the answer, is the solution to problems that more Europe has created in the first place. So there's a very weak support for that idea. We know, and we talked about the situation in Germany. In Germany, we know that transfer unions are not a good idea. We have a transfer union in Germany, from West to East Germany, and it has resulted in a welfare explosion quote unquote, in East Germany, but it has, and the amount of money was not insignificant. We talk about 2,000 billion euros of transfers over in the last 20 or so years. But it has not resulted in an economy that grows faster than the West. The West still grows faster than the East. So we know when we talk about, when Germans have some second thoughts about transfer unions, we know why. I don't think in Europe need a system that stymies dynamic economic development, and I do not think that any comparison with the United States is appropriate. Often you hear the United States is a kind of a monetary union, and they are having some kinds of transfers to start with. Europe is a club of very diverging societies with very diverging histories. The Spanish society differs sharply from the Finnish society and from the Dutch society. And the Greek society differs from the Italian society and from the Polish society and the Slovakian and so on and so forth. In political science parlance, member countries of the European Union have diverging preferences in a range of areas. They have diverging preferences in social policy, in fiscal policy, and so on and so forth. A one-size-fits-all policy is wrong for Europe. We have in the past centuries prospered because of diversity, not despite diversity. And diversity, I think, is a key to understanding why Europe is where it is today. Why should Europeans be forced to find a consensus on all those issues? Why should all economic policy be harmonized and centralized? I don't have an answer to that. And I don't see that anybody has an answer to that. Why should Europeans, for instance, be told that there is a certain retirement age? We have young societies in Europe, we have old societies in Europe. We Germans are an old society, we probably have to work until we're 75. Probably not 75, but 70. But there are younger societies which can afford that you retire at 62. Why should there be a uniform social policy in that respect? We also would have to answer the question whether or not centralized systems have empirically fared better than decentralized systems. And I wouldn't draw the comparison to the Soviet Union, but I do think that decentralized systems have worked better. And finally, we have to ask, what is the political legitimacy of these supranational structures? We already have a legitimacy deficit in the European Union. Brussels does what it wants without being controlled. How can you ensure that there will be more control at the European level if you centralize? So that is difficult. I think, politically speaking, centralization will lead to less, not more, support for the integration process, and the question whether it is necessary can probably also be answered with a no. A common currency does not require centralized fiscal policy. It requires a set of rules, and those rules need to be adhered to. And if countries feel that they rather not adhere to the rules, they shall be permitted to leave the monetary union. It is not nice, again, it's a choice between a rock and a hard place. But what we're doing at the moment, telling Greek society what to do, sending a troika there, depriving Greek society of ownership of that development process, is a disaster. It doesn't work. Greek society is currently fighting the troika, but they're not solving their problems. And this will happen time and again if you do the same thing in Italy or wherever you do it. This is not a good, convincing approach. I think we should return to a rules-based process, and we should stop to ignore the existing rules. We do have rules. Now, the lack of support of the integration process continues to be a problem. I would like to the figures of a poll that was taken in 2012 in December. And the question was, is Germany's influence in Europe too high? Now, Germany is, I interpret this as Germany standing for an external influence that tells you what to do in economic policy. It's a chiffre for the Troika, so to speak. 84% of Italians and 84% of Spaniards said, yes, Germany's influence in Europe is too high at the moment. In the same poll, 74% of Italians and 71% of the Spanish said the Germans should show more solidarity towards Italy and Spain. So in other words, the figure for Germany was 16%. In other words, Europeans are currently deeply split over this issue. The Italians, to put it in a different context, the Italians would say that Germans should pay more, but should not tell them what to do. And of course, the Germans say, well, if we pay, we want to tell you what to do. And this is an unresolved conflict. The solution, I think, is the return to the concept of the Treaty of Maastricht from 1991, support in crisis, but the principle that fiscal policy and its consequences are national, not European, should be revived. To sum up, and I come to an end, I look forward to the discussion. I think despite my relatively negative comments, I think the situation in Europe is serious, but not as bad as some observers suggest. The crisis has, and I haven't addressed that, but we can do that in the discussion, the crisis has been used in a number of countries to implement overdue reforms. Labor markets in Spain and Italy are case in point. Crisis management has been suboptimal. There has been no coherent strategy of liquidity provision, and the monetary policy of the ECB has been quite risky. The collateral damage excuse me, is quite substantial. The integration process is no longer the only game in town. The Eurozone has almost become a four-letter word in some circles in Europe, and this is nowhere better expressed than by a statement of the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who said in spring 2011, the Eurozone, and I quote, "The Eurozone is not ready for Polish membership." And it would have been different in the years before. The challenge, of course, is to return the Eurozone to a club that countries would like to join rather than would like to leave. As Marx said, and it's of course the other Marx, I don't care to belong to a club that will have me as a member. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Deiter. I think you've posed a set of questions which are intriguing, and the solutions that you find for them are equally intriguing. And let me take the privilege of being here at this moment in front of the mic to pose a few of my own to you, and then leave it to the audience to take it forward from here. Very quickly, I mean, sure. You talked about three issues that you addressed in your talk today. One was about the what kind of monetary policy will survive in the EU? Is there something to learn from the US regarding the manner in which capitalist systems survive? And the third on what are the alternative policies that the euro faces today? And I was wondering, while you were going through your talk, whether what has happened in the US in terms of either closing down institutions or keeping them alive is something that the European Union wants to replicate in some ways. Because we also heard when there was an attempt to keep the financial system stable in the US, CEOs and CFOs of many banks went home with paychecks which were unbelievably high, which was meant for depositors' refunds but didn't actually reach them. And that's the seamier side of financial sector revivalism that happens when the Fed steps in. And there is also the question of does capitalism survive with nationalization of these banks when Feds step in? So there's that twin problem that the US faced. They also went about kind of securing their insurance industry when AIG went into a crisis. And I was not sure whether you have a thought on that, but let it be on the table for discussion. The third thing I thought you might want, you didn't raise, but you might have an opinion on is the renegotiation of the Maastricht Treaty itself, because some of the discussion that has happened as far as revitalizing the European Union, some consider it still not out of the crisis yet, is a mechanism of pump priming through increased government expenditure. Cyprus and Greece don't really, affect the European monetary union in that difficult a sense. You can easily throw them out and not really have a sense of crisis. But if you take Spain, Italy, Portugal, they are big economies, and what you can do to Greece, you probably cannot do to Italy and Spain and have a political union survive. So would there be an attempt to renegotiate the Maastricht Treaty, especially with regard to your debt GDP ratios at 60% and raise it to something much higher? And we know that the Japanese economy has, for a very long period of time, survived with much higher rates, and so has the US economy. So is there some discussion that is on those lines? So with those thoughts, let me open it up to the floor for comments, statements, and further discussion.
Is systematically relevant, and that too with the banks, which Japan did something and US did something. And a statement of yours which you said low or worst performers should quit. So now in the case of Greece, Greece has been performing very bad in Eurozone and in Europe. So do you think Greece should leave Eurozone? And if yes, what will be the effects on Eurozone? If no, what are the reasons that you, from Germany's perspective, would not allow Greece to leave?
Hello. I have a vested interest in what you said, because I'm a British citizen and therefore that much more interested, I suspect, than some of the people here. Do you think, I'm being deliberately provocative, I hope you don't mind, do you think to some extent the entire European experiment is in danger of going wrong because of the persistence of the crises that we've seen? Now, I know you mentioned Cyprus, and you more or less tossed it aside. The other speaker did too. But I've been looking at the financial, I'm a financial person myself, I've been looking at the financial reaction to what has happened in Cyprus. It's not very funny when Cypriots have to lose 6.75% of their deposits. That's not very funny. And the impact that it has had on the financial markets, and I'm speaking about very responsible financial journalists who now say, let's take to the hills. You know, for instance, the Western stock markets in the last 6 months have been doing very well. But ever since the Cypriot crisis, there has been almost a rush to the hills, as it were. You see, the stock markets have taken a seat back. And what I'm posing to you is a fundamental question. The question that with this insistence on the euro and the stringent discipline involved, would it not be better off to have the Maggie Thatcher idea of having a loose confederation of states and echo the feeling that Ted Heath used to say? I mean, Ted Heath talked about the European home. Now, you don't need a European home. You don't need a European home.
These are quite substantial questions already, so I will try my best to answer them. I'm not a friend of these absurdly high salaries of CEOs in the United States and elsewhere. Richard Fuld, the failed chairman of Lehman Sachs, not Lehman Sachs, wishful thinking, of Lehman Brothers, collected 500 million US dollars in salary in the years before he left the bank in September 2008. And I think this is a question that ought to be solved. I have nothing against substantial salaries in the event of success. But if failure is rewarded with 500 million, then there's something wrong. So I think we have to think very thoroughly about incentive schemes for managers in financial and other companies. And I do think we should separate that from the question of whether we want to close banks or not. These are two different questions. I do think, well, let me put it like that. I think that closing or not rescuing Lehman was inevitable. People have been saying, is the European Union in danger? Is the concept of European integration in danger? I'm afraid it is to a degree. I mean, the old generation of policymakers, Jacques Delors was the person that provided that joke on the Bundesbank and the Germans. Jacques Delors, Helmut Kohl, these were people who based their policies on the experience of World War II and the immediate aftermath of World War II. For them, European integration was the only path to stability and peace in Europe. And they have, of course, succeeded. Europe has not seen armed conflict apart from the Balkans in the last 70 years, and it is quite unlikely that we will see any conflict in the near future. For the more pragmatic generation that was born after the war, this is not that much of an issue. Angela Merkel is known to be pragmatic. She has an academic degree in physics, so this is a very down-to-earth science, as we all know, and she is evaluating. She is exactly asking that question that I've suggested: is it better inside? Is it better outside? For the time being, nobody questions that, apart from the Brits, and the Brits have always been, as you know, reluctant participants in the European Union. I think it is appropriate that they put membership to a referendum. If they want to go, they shall go. We cannot close the doors and turn the European Union into some kind of Hotel California where you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. This is in the Treaty of Lisbon. If you want to leave, leave. Why not? I mean, I think on balance the benefits are higher than the costs, but it should be up to each and every member country to evaluate that. The European Union, for the time being, however, continues to be a club of sovereign nations. It is the child, not the parent, of the member countries, and the parents decide what happens in Europe, and not the child, not the European Union. So if any country wants to leave, this country has the legal right, and is a sovereign country that can leave. And we have to be very careful with the future development of the European integration process. I think a vast majority of Europeans don't want to go back to what we have now. I think there is very little sympathy to go back to a stage without a common currency and with borders, with passports. But there is equally limited willingness to go further. And if in Germany we currently see the emergence of not just one but two parties that are going to be running for the September 2013 federal elections. One is called the Association of Free Citizens, and the other is called the Alternative for Germany, and both are critical of European integration, and that has never occurred before. So Britain is not alone with its doubts, and but on balance, I think if we are cautious, we can keep the process intact. It is not just de Gaulle who can be quoted. De Gaulle who said, "I want a Europe of fatherlands." You can go back to Kant in Kant's work in the 19th century, he talked about a confederation of states rather than a federal state. So, I mean, you have ample philosophical support for this assessment that a looser federation is a more stable one.
Anything left to ask, because you've been so elaborate with regard to the complexity of the crisis. I'm from the Department of Political Science. I've worked a little bit on some of the monetary initiatives that were taken up by developing countries in the context of South-South cooperation in the 70s. And what we find is that perhaps this is the right time to visit some of those formulations. But the language that we see emerging, not just from Europe or the US, but also developing countries. Nobody talks about those measures which perhaps would have provided a kind of cushion in such times. Taking Europe's own example, feasibility of a payments union, clearing houses. We do hear of currency stabilization funds, but nobody talks about whether there is a need to reinterpret clearing arrangements, which were indirectly supposed to act as hedges against such eventualities. So do you think somewhere down the line there is this crisis of not wanting to go back to those innocent days when such crisis did not happen, and perhaps maybe not in the same way, but solutions could be thought of for that sake?
Very grateful for the last question. Not in my lifetime, I think, and I don't have the intention to pass away quickly. So I mean, being in the UK regularly, I do not see any interest apart from a few interest groups that would benefit from a stable monetary environment with regard stable exchange rates. I don't see any support for that. I mean, when I learned English at school, there was this famous article, Fog in the Channel, Continent Isolated, and my impression is that many people in the UK would rather have it like that. And joining, I mean now, joining the Euro is a very unrealistic prospect. So things may change. The European integration project may recover more quickly, and I'm quite confident that it will recover more quickly than some pessimists or some skeptical observers are currently willing to concede. And it is a question then whether the United Kingdom and its population will be willing to leave in 2018. At our institute we have been discussing of course, speculating is a nice endeavor, isn't it? So we have been speculating what would happen if Scotland would declare itself independent at the same time as the UK would like to leave the European Union. Could Scotland then on the same day re-enter as an independent country of the European Union? And with what currency? Same for Catalonia. These are just games. It shows you, it reflects how relatively benign the situation is. We can make jokes about those things. We can engage in those ideas without feeling an urgent risk that something will move in a direction which nobody wants. So there is no chance of a destabilized Europe in the near future. There may be economic turbulence and so on and so forth, but this is all relatively benign. On the question of what we could learn from previous regimes, I'm all with you. But I have written a paper together with a friend from Warwick who is now in Perth on the rather strange policies that we are following in global economic governance. Because in global economic governance, what the G20 tries to do at the moment, regional rules for trade, and we have global rules for finance. And this friend of mine and and I, Richard Higgett and I, we have been suggesting that we should have the opposite. We should have global rules for trade, and we should have regional and or national rules for finance. To start with, we are suggesting that global rules for finance have been a big failure. They haven't worked. Basel I, for instance, had a regulation that encouraged government deficit spending, because banks in Basel I, and this is still the regulation of Basel II and Basel III, which is supposed to come, banks don't have to put aside capital when they lend to governments, because lending to governments was considered by the creators of Basel I to be risk-free. But what do you get? You get a borrowing binge. And you can, I mean, there is at least a correlation between the rising levels of government debt in OECD countries after 1990 and Basel I and Basel II. In Basel II, we had another not so successful global regulation. The regulation in Basel II was that lending for real estate purposes doesn't require capital.
I think all of you would agree with me that on a topic as technical as the financial crisis, Professor Dieter has been quite sensitive to the kind of audience we have, which is a mix of majority economics students, faculty, some political science and international relations. And in that sense, you've tried to maintain a tone in your lecture where I think there has been something in it for all of us. In that sense, thank you, Professor, very much for a very engaging talk that you gave. And I personally take a lot from your advice that yes, this is an area where a lot of interdisciplinary research is required. And then in India, there are not many people who are working on this theme in this kind of an integrated way. So thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to remaining in touch with you. I also take this opportunity to thank Ms. Nandini Sahai, who has been a friend of the university, who took the initiative to contact us and approach us with this very topical theme. Normally, whenever she collaborates on such functions, she always likes to have these functions at the International Center Goa. So I mean, that way, that's what her location is, and she's not willing to let it go. But the very fact that she reached out to us and she agreed to bring the speaker here, well, thank you very much. And I hope this will be one of the many future interactions you will have. My thanks to the other departmental colleagues from Center for Latin American Studies who have also collaborated with us in this venture, all the faculty members, and I presume we have academic staff college participants of economics who have come here. Thank you very much. And particularly the students who have stayed beyond their lecture hours today to listen to Professor Dieter. So thank you very much for being here with us. And I think we can invite you all for a cup of tea outside. Thank you.
Thank you very much.